Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. From time to time, it's been raised in some of the debates and about creation that teaching creation in schools would really limit the advancement of science. And I think there was a program by an American speaker and engineer by the name of Bill Nye, and he debated a creationist, and then after that put out a book. And from what I remember, in essence, his point was that it was so important that young people be taught the theory of evolution, because this really had the potential to lead to so many new, scientific discoveries and this sort of thing. And of course, the converse of this was that if, young people were taught creation, then this would really stifle the development of science. And of course, this wasn't new. Probably going back a couple of decades now, that a young geologist, Andrew Snelling, graduated with his PhD from the University of Sydney in geology, and he was a very strong and very active creationist and has authored, or been a co-author in a number of books on creation and articles related to creation, evidence for creation, particularly from a geological point of view, and the very compelling evidence from geology for a global flood, for example. And it was quite interesting that one of the professors of a very large Australian university wrote to the University of Sydney asking them to rescind the doctorate that had been awarded to Dr. Snelling, but because he was a creationist, and really he shouldn't have that doctorate. So it was a very interesting scenario that has come out from that, and this whole impression, we can't teach children about creation because it's really going to limit their capacity in science or their ability to contribute as scientists. And then, of course, there's the other view that those people that believe in creation are really, uneducated. Well, as this, topic is discussed, I guess there's another aspect to this too, and that is that there are many top scientists who are Christians, but they don't accept the literal creation account, or they don't believe in the life on Earth and Earth being only 6,000 years old or something like this. And so one of the things that I thought I'd have a look at today in the talk was the looking at the background for this, because one of my science heroes is James Clerk Maxwell, and he was the physicist at the University of Cambridge that developed electromagnetic field theory and demonstrated that light and heat, these forms of radiation, were combinations of electric and magnetic fields. And he laid essentially the foundation too for Einstein's theories then to be developed from. And Maxwell, of course, was a really strong creationist and very, very outspoken anti-evolutionist as well, and a brilliant scientist. So that obviously, disproves that. And in fact, my book, In 6 Days, Why 50 Scientists Choose to Believe in Creation, when I wrote to scientists around the world and simply asked them, why do you believe in a literal 6-day creation only thousands of years ago? And when I looked down through the list of this in the table of contents, so all these scientists have doctorates, and we have, for example, Dr. Jeremy Walter, and he heads at the Penn State University the underwater propulsion research lab for the US Navy. So obviously he is a top engineer to have that position, to be developing and heading up the research in this area for the US Navy, the underwater propulsion laboratory there. And of course, some people say, well, look, he's an engineer. What would he know about creation and evolution? Well, need to remember too, for example, people like Bill Nye. Bill Nye was an engineer, and he's an outspoken pro-evolutionist, and, people gladly take on his books. If I read a little bit further down the list, I see Dr. John Kramer. He's a biochemist. And, of course, one of the guys that led the team that developed canola oil. He works at the University of Guelph and the Canadian Department of Agriculture. I've met him in person. I've met a number of his colleagues too that speak so highly of him and his research, world-leading research in his area. And he's a biochemist and a very, very strong creationist as well. If I look down, Henry Zuhl, he was also a professor of biology and the curator of an arboretum that was associated with one of the state arboreums in the US. If I look at Dr. Ariel Roth, another guy with a PhD in biology who for many years served as the director of the Geoscience Research Institute and the editor of the journal Origins. There's Dr. Keith Wanzer, who's a professor of physics at the California State University, Riverside. There's Dr. John Rankin, who is a senior lecturer in mathematical physics at one of the Australian universities, I think the University of La Trobe. There's George Javer, another biochemist who is professor of biochemistry in the medical school at Loma Linda University, which has quite a famous medical school. To look at Dr. Stephen Grocott, which headed the research division. He was the general manager of research for a large Australian mineral processing company. Dr. Andrew McIntosh, who was a professor in the area of combustion theory at the University of Leeds, and of course he had both a doctorate and DSc in mathematics. So all these people, these are scientists that are experts in their field that are really strong creationists. So, for example, Andy McIntosh has written books on creation and on Genesis, and of course he's a world authority, as I said, in the area of combustion theory, and also the bombardier beetle. And and he points out that the combustion chamber and system and the chemical reactions in the bombardier beetle just couldn't evolve. The thing, the animal would blow up during the experimental stage. And another professor is Dr. John Simpala, is professor of, I think, mechanical engineering at Penn State University. Then there's Dr. Edward Bordeaux, the theoretical chemist and professor of theoretical chemistry at Louisiana State University. There's Dr. Kerr Thompson, who was the director of the US Air Force Geosciences Research Laboratory. So here again, these guys are really strong creationists. They write articles in the area of creationists, and they're top scientists in their field. Dr. John Baumgartner worked at the Los Alamos Research Laboratories there in the US. He's a geophysicist. If I look at Professor David Gower, who is professor of biochemistry at the University of London and developed a number of discovered a number of the human hormones. He was emeritus professor of steroid biochemistry there. We look at Professor Walter Wyeth, who is professor of zoology at the University of Western Cape. So here, and here's, again, very, very strong creationist now. Well, he was an atheist. One had grants from the Royal Society and so forth for his research. And yet here he is a really strong creationist now. He converted from that atheist position as he was looking at the evidence there. Dr. Robert Heckles, professor of medicine at the University of Colorado, and was a chairman of one of the divisions of the American Heart Association. Then, of course, we've got Dr. Andrew Snelling with his PhD in geology from the University of Sydney that, again, as I mentioned earlier, writes these books and research specifically in the area of evidence for creation. There's Dr. Colin Mitchell. He's died now, but he was educated at the universities of Harvard, Oxford and Cambridge, and he was a geographer and an advisor to the United Nations with regard to agriculture and climate and agriculture for developing countries around the world. There's Dr. Stanley Mummer, who's a professor of architectural engineering at Penn State University. We could, keep on going down through this list of sort of Werner Gitt, who was director of the Federal Institute of Physics and Technology in Germany. I think that's the institute where Einstein studied many years earlier, of course. And he's a world authority in information technology, and again points out the overwhelming evidence that we have that information must have an intelligent source. The DNA codes, all these sort of things, absolutely impossible for these codes that are in living organisms to arise by chance random mutations. There's just so much information encoded in these biological codes that encode for all the different biological systems that work. These are systems that work. And we know at the present time, for example, scientists around the world are working so hard to develop a vaccine to combat the AIDS virus. Now, this will involve the synthesis of different molecules and so forth that can counter the action of the AIDS virus. Well, we need to understand that the human immune system that deals with so many of these other viruses and so forth that are already in the system, and bad bacteria and all this sort of thing that protects our body from disease and illness, works. It has all these systems that work, and they're extremely complicated. Now we're just trying to extend that by just one little extra bit to combat this other virus. We've got teams of intelligent scientists working around the world, and they seem to struggling to be coming up with a vaccine that will work. There are a number, it appears to be, starting trials. And so forth. And we know that they haven't been able to develop a vaccine against AIDS or the SARS virus and so forth. So it's amazing that the chemistry that we have in our body works for a whole range of things, extremely complex systems, particularly in our immune system, defence systems in our body that are set up. And so evolutionists have to believe that the codes that are responsible for making the compounds that are involved and the chemical structures that are involved in these biological systems arose by chance whereas Werner Gitt points out, and here we have its world authority pointing out that absolutely impossible for these codes to arrive by chance. They have to have an intelligent origin, and a super intelligent origin, far superior to human intelligence. When we look at the human systems, when we look at the systems in human DNA, animal DNA and so forth. And again, if you want to read what these scientists themselves point out and argue in these areas of biology, biochemistry, geology and so forth, the book is called In 6 Days, Why 50 Scientists Choose to Believe in Creation, edited by myself, John F. Ashton. And so it's available. Matter of fact, I looked on Amazon this morning, and it was rated as number 15 in the top-selling books on creationism. And this is interesting because the book came out a number of years ago, but it's still a top seller there. And by the way, some of the books that were ahead of it listed were Bibles or were books supporting evolution and arguing against creation. So it's still selling as one of the top books defending creation. Also, it's available as a free download on the creation.com website. So if you Google creation.com and go into their search engine and enter In 6 Days, that's the word 6, S-I-X, and in the search engine, and I think it's the first or second link that will come up will be a link to the actual book. And when you open that link up, it might say the preface, which is a section I wrote, and then down the side, on the left-hand side usually, there'll be a list of names. They're the names of the creation scientists, and if you click on the name, their article will come up. And so these are top scientists. So to say that being a creationist limits you being a scientist really has no foundation. And of course now, if you go on to another website, Descent from Darwin, there's over 1,000 scientists now who have signed up to that. And these are all scientists with doctorates in the fields related to evolution, like biology, biochemistry, geology, paleontology, these sort of areas, that now say, whoa, we've got major problems with evolution, the theory of evolution. It doesn't work. I think, as I've mentioned before, probably one of the main reasons why some Christian scientists have their doubts about the biblical In 6 Day account is the radiometric dating issue. And I mentioned recently too that there's some evidence with regard to accelerated radioactive decay during the flood. And so I'll just expand on a little bit that Dr. Andrew Snelling wrote in one of the books that I co-edited. It's called The Big Argument. 24 scholars explore why science, archaeology and philosophy haven't disproved God. And this is a very interesting aspect to take. Science has not disproved God. And there are a number of authors that contributed to this book. It has a number of sections. First one was Has Science Disproved God by Barry Whitney, then Fingerprints of the Divine All Around Us by Danny Faulkner, who was an astronomer, professor of astronomy who was a creationist. Where Did the Universe Come From? Kenneth Himmer. Design by Information, Dr. Werner Gitt, that I mentioned earlier. These are all guys that have contributed chapter to this book, The Big Argument. So it's edited by myself, John Ashton, and also Michael Westacott. And this is an interesting account, and of course there's many more chapters of this in the book. Design in Nature, Evidence for a Creator by Dr. Ariel Roth that I mentioned before. Scientific Case for Creation by Dr. George Javer. Geological Evidence for Creation, Dr. Andrew Snelling, and I'll just read a little bit from his there as well. But there's some other interesting chapters in this book. For example, Where Do Thoughts Come From by Charles Taliaferro. The Question of Biology by David Catchpool. The Question of Moral Values from Stephen Cohen. The Problem of Evil by Dr. John Pauline. Who is God and Was He Like by Dr. Steve Thompson. Will the Real God Please Stand Up? Eric Svensson. And then there's a whole section on God history in the Bible. Can the Bible be relied on? By Stephen Caesar. Historical evidence for the biblical flood, Dr. Jerry Bourbon. Oh, by the way, all these guys have doctorates that contributed to the book. I'm from memory pretty sure. There might have been two. David Down didn't have a doctorate. Archaeological evidence for the Exodus. Historical reliability of the Old Testament, Paul Ferguson. Archaeological reliability of the New Testament, John McRae. He's a leading professor in this area at the University of Chicago. What about the Bible's scientific reliability? Dr. Tim Standish, another creationist. Amazing biblical prophecies that came to pass, Dr. William Shea. The Messianic prophecies fulfilled in Jesus by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, and of course he is quite a well-known Messianic Jewish scholar that writes in this area. And evidence for Jesus' resurrection, Michael Licona. And he's also co-authored books with the mathematician William Dembski as well. And, so all those contributors in that book, The Big Argument, 24 scholars explore why science, archaeology and philosophy haven't disproved God. And so in this section here, looking at the geological evidence for creation, Dr. Andrew Snelling points out that when we look at a lot of work that has been done now, dating recent lavas that have spewed out of volcanoes around the world, and when we measure the dates on these lavas, they come out as millions of years old, hundreds of millions of years old. Sometimes they come date as billions of years old, and yet they're historic lavas. We know when they erupted, so many hundred years ago, and so forth. And it's been recognised that, of course, something's happened that stirred up these dates that were of rocks that conventionally would be dated, millions, hundreds of millions of years old, and mix them up. But notwithstanding that, he points out that when we look at the geological column, generally the rocks that are deeper in the geological column give older radiometric dates, and the ones closer to the top give younger radiometric dates. And this has led people to have perhaps more confidence than they should in the radiometric dating method. But what he points out is that during the flood, there were massive plate tectonic movements, there was massive erosion, sedimentation, fossilisation, there were massive processes occurring. And it's consistent that there were changes in radiometric decay occurring also at catastrophic rates that yield radiometric dates much later than the true ages of the rock. In other words, there was accelerated radiometric decay. And we know that this can happen. A lot of people assume that the rates of decay are constant. And, of course, this is the basis of the radiometric decay calculations. But in actual fact, we know they change under conditions. They change in relation to sunspot variation. They change as a result of extreme temperatures and pressures. So when we look at this, there is evidence of more rapid radiometric decay. And firstly, when uranium decays in tiny zircon crystals in the granites, it produces both lead and helium. And while the lead gives conventional old dates, the helium, when we look at the helium, amount of helium there, it points to a very, very young date, and yet these are coming from the same reaction. Secondly, when uranium decays, there are radio halos produced for both the uranium and daughter products such as polonium. Now, uranium halos supposedly take hundreds of millions of years to be produced, in contrast to polonium halos that form in minutes and days. Well, they find they're both together. And so again, this points to very, very young ages for these granites. And so there's a lot of other evidence for a young Earth. The radiocarbon dating, where they find, and they'll find a granite that is, say, encased some wood, and they find they'll date the granite as being old, millions of years old, but carbon date the wood, and it'll be only thousands of years old. Secondly, he points out that when we date the coal seams, these all with radiocarbon dates, all come out as only thousands of years old. And he then goes on to point out too that, and this is a very important point, that measurements made over the past century and a half have revealed that the Earth's magnetic field is steadily decreasing in strength and losing energy. At the measured rate of decrease, the Earth's magnetic field cannot be any older than 6,000 to 7,000 years. Now, that's important. And furthermore, evidence has been found the Earth's magnetic field has been rapidly reversing in the past, particularly during the catastrophic plate tectonics of the global flood and its aftermath. And only freeing decaying electric currents in the Earth's core can explain the generation and rapid reversal of the Earth's magnetic field in its young age. And it follows that if the Earth's magnetic field is only 6,000 or 7,000 years old, the Earth itself is young. And he points out there's numerous other evidences for the Earth's youthfulness, such as the accumulation of salt in the sea, the helium in the atmosphere, sediments on the ocean floor, and erosion rates of continents and all this sort of thing. And so when we look at this evidence, the evidence strongly confirms the biblical account. And we can see that the creation account often, I think overall, provides scientists with a much, much better base for science. And we've seen that there were so many scientists, leading scientists, who are making these contributions in the world today that are creationists. You've been listening to Faith and Science, and if you want to re-listen to this program or any of the other programs, remember you just Google 3ABN Australia, or one word, .org.au, and click on the listen button. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.